So it's really happy times again to be here with Sherie Harkins. We haven't talked for quite some time. And Sherie is an artist. You can see her beautiful artwork behind her there. And Sherie also has a YouTube channel where she talks to artists. And she also, are you still working on managing that, facilitating that group of artists that get together periodically and talk about fascinating topics?
I am, yes. We are continuing to meet bi-weekly. It's always kind of changing a little bit. I've been very lax about working on my own YouTube channel. I moved again last October, and between packing and unpacking and being here, I just terrible at managing everything. So,
Well, it does take time. Yeah.
yeah, I don't know how you do it. I really don't know how you do it.
Well, I mean, I'm fortunate in that I'm not obligated to do a whole lot of other things because I'm sort of retired, I guess you could say. So, and my husband is still working hard in Silicon Valley, so that gives me a lot of free hours in the day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you are amazing. I mean, you're amazing how you've come to like understand the things you're talking about too. I'm always just, so impressed with the information that you have and the background knowledge and how you can relate to the things that they're talking about and pull it up. I have been very interested in quantum physics myself, but I have nowhere near the knowledge base that you do and could never hold a conversation. So,
Well, I mean, truthfully, I don't know anything about the mathematics of how it works. And the mathematics of how it works is how it really works. So um, I've been more interested in the kind of philosophical
mm,
ideas that are related to quantum physics. And the other areas that I look at in biochemistry and chemistry and biology and even mathematics, when I do read up on them, I'm not so much taking in the all the details of what people are saying, but because I put it through this filter of the way the elements and principles work in art, somehow it just slots in my brain in those slots, and it makes it easier for me to understand the basic principles that are being talked about. And that's why I can hold a lot of information. Otherwise, it would just all seep out.
mhm,
But
mhm.
I know the artistic principles so well. It's just it's part of my whole being. So yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about because um, I still don't feel like I have a good handle on how you're connecting that to reality or to the way that the cosmos work and the way that God's designed things and planned things out. But I feel like I just haven't quite grasped it. Or haven't grasped it at all, maybe is a better way, or something in between. So I'm always coming back to it and thinking about, well, how does this fit into Karen's idea? And is this something I can respond to or relate to? I haven't gotten there yet, but I understand that sense of feeling like you're right on the verge of something, or there's something running around the periphery of what you're thinking and you haven't quite grasped it, but you feel like, or in a way that you can explain it as much as you want to, but you feel like there's something there. So I'm excited to continue our relationship so that I can eventually get to the place where I understand what you
Well,
mean.
so then that's a problem that I have not been able to explain very well to anybody because you and I had a whole hour and a half conversation about that. And if I didn't get it across, then there's a problem in the way I'm explaining it. But let me give you just a little example of something that came up the other day for me. I've been very interested in the work of Michael Levin, who is a synthetic biologist and a researcher, and he does a lot of work with multicellular organisms. And one of the kind of research experiments that they did was to remove some frog skin cells from the frog and put it in some sort of I suppose, something like a petri dish. And what they observed within 48 hours, those skin cells, even though they were no longer connected to each other, had gathered together and had formed a little what they call a bot, they call it a xenobot because the name of the frog starts with xenopus something something. So they call this a little xenobot, and it takes the cilia from the skin cells and puts that on the outside of the bot so that it can use it as motive power to get around in the fluid. And then they can actually gather other skin cells up into little balls so that they also form up into these little entities. And they can live, they can eat, they can get rid of their waste, but there's nothing there but skin cells. There's no neurons, there's nothing, okay? They're just frog skin cells. And the DNA hasn't changed, but they are living entities. Mm-hmm. And his story about that is now that they're free and they're not being bullied by the rest of the cells that were surrounding them before, now that they're free, they can do what they really want to do, which is to form up into these little bots and scurry around. And I thought, that doesn't seem right. I don't think that's what's happening. Because obviously they're trying to survive, because you've now changed their boundaries. You've changed their environment. You've changed their boundaries. So they have no choice. This is what they have to do if they want to survive. But who's to say that they didn't, obviously maybe cells don't have a feeling, but when they were frog skin cells, they had a purpose. And they were connected to the frog, and they were doing something maybe of a higher import for the frog, because to be a skin cell is to protect the boundary of the frog and to allow, good things in and bad things out, all those things that a boundary does.
Part of the body.
Yeah, and as long as they were part of the body, then they had a purpose. Mm-hmm. And who's to say that that's worse? Maybe they weren't in bondage to these other cells. Right, maybe they were doing what they were meant to do, their high calling.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so whenever I see something like this that changes a boundary condition, there's a thing about it that seems like it's like a utopian ideal, sort of. Here, we'll change that boundary and we'll make it this boundary over here where you're not going to have any limitations and you can do whatever you want and be completely free. Well, maybe people will figure out something to do in that environment, but that's not necessarily their best and highest calling. And it's the same way for me with art. If I have boundary conditions, I can create much more innovatively than if I just have no boundary conditions at all. I was telling you earlier that in my studio, I have so many different kinds of materials and so many different kinds of substrates and so many different colors of paint, and not just paint, but, markers and many different kinds of brushes and charcoal. And I could create anything I wanted, but it's too much, too many opportunities. And if I don't have a specific goal, I can't create anything because I get just completely immobilized. Well, to me, that's a very basic principle, that if you're inundated with combinatorial explosion, you get immobilized. So I don't think it's always best to just be cut off from your surroundings and be thrown into this completely new free environment as though that's going to be this great place. I mean, that's just one little aspect of it, but
I think that's a really interesting point to think about, how that freedom can actually not allow us to reach the potential that we were created for. Like it might feel like that is a better thing to experience than working through the obstacles or dealing with those things that impact our lack of freedom. And yet, what can we become when we're part of the conglomerate? Which is actually sort of interesting too, because I've been thinking a lot about how does art fit into to the kingdom? And when we think about artists that are creating music, there's that opportunity for people to create music together. So you have voices and you have instruments, and sometimes you have a whole congregation, sometimes you have individual people. So they're creating something together. It's actually, I have a theory that it's why there are so frequently affairs and things like that that happen in either musical bands or theater groups, because they're in this process of creating something together. And that's such a heady, amazing, when you know that you're doing something that people are able to respond to and people are able to read and recognize, and that's an amazing experience. And so when people are doing that together, I think it's easy to sort of become confused about what's happening with the group versus individually. But and even in dance, I think that can happen, where you sort of are doing something. I mean, my very limited experience in aerobics classes in the gym, where you see the mirror and everybody is doing the same thing. It's such an amazing, heady experience. Even that silliness of like, we're all moving to the music together and we're all doing the same thing. It's just such a cool thing. So, but when I'm painting, I'm all alone in my studio, there's nobody there with me. It's so different. And so I think a lot about why, it's so different. My husband plays the guitar and he, has the experience of playing with other people, and each person is lending their unique abilities with their instruments and their unique voices, and they're harmonizing. And it's so different than what I do in the studio by myself. Have you ever thought about that or considered
Well,
that?
maybe what you're doing
experience.
in the studio by yourself is more akin to a composer.
Maybe.
Composer working alone. They have an idea, maybe full blown in their head, maybe just an inkling, and they have to work their way through it. And you're working your way through it problem by problem. I mean, this is one of the first things that I noticed when I started painting, because I thought, well, how hard can it be to just take a photograph of something and then reproduce it in paint? How hard can it be? Right? So you have this photograph, it's got a little cottage maybe and some flowers outside, and there's some bushes and some trees in the background and sky. Okay, I'm going to paint this. And then as you start, of course, it's not that easy, first of all, to paint something. You find that out very quickly. But then you also find out you're looking at this photograph and what is that thing right there? I can't tell what that is. So if I'm trying to represent it faithfully, I don't know what I'm representing. And that makes it very difficult to even try to represent it because you can't figure out what it is. Or maybe the cottage is in the wrong place in the rectangle to have the most pleasing view. Well, what are you going to do? You're going to paint it exactly the way it is. You're going to move it over a little bit so that the perspective is better, right? And maybe there's some wires, some phone wires going through the photograph where the wires are coming in. Well, that doesn't look very attractive. Should I paint it or not? And then if you paint it, does it look awkward and clumsy? And would people say, gee, it would have been better if you hadn't done that? But then there are some of these marvelous, especially the Chinese artists, they have a way of painting telephone lines that's just so beautiful, and so there's just all these problems that have to be solved one by one, even if you're trying to paint representationally. But then if you're trying to paint something that is an abstract or non-objective, then you're trying to solve a whole different set of problems, like what color is going to make the color next to it really sing, and how am I going to bring out these very delicate, subtle shadings next to each other? And, there's all kinds of problems that you're working on. So it's like being in a group and working on problems together, but now you're working on the problem all by yourself. It's a very different experience.
Well, and when we think about it within the church, and I'll tell you a couple of my sort of observations that I've seen about it, but then we can sort of more easily, I think, identify ways that musicians are able to participate in the worship experience or bring something to the congregation, be that part of the body, so that even if they're not the part of the body that is teaching, or they're not the part of the body that's preaching, or they're not the part of the body that is serving in some way, serving in a in a more service oriented way, like cleaning up or cooking or hospitality or things like that. We don't sort of question the idea. Usually we don't question the idea that the musicians are bringing something that is good for the congregation. They're bringing something that blesses the corporate group. But we don't really do that with visual art, like visual art now is becoming more a part of the church. But I think people are still kind of unsure of what to do with it, and how does it fit in, and what does it do. And I know you had done something like last year or sometime within the past year where you were going to paint as a part of the service. How did that go? Was that good?
I've done it a number of times, but this time that I did it specifically for the church that we attend, it was a marvelous experience. Now, it happened to be during COVID, so there wasn't a congregation there, but they filmed the whole process. And so I was painting while the worship team was playing the music, and then I had an opportunity to finish it up a little bit before the message. And then after the message, I had a chance to talk with the pastor about the painting and how the painting fit in with what the theme was of the morning. And it was really interesting to me because I didn't know what the message was going to be about, and I hadn't heard the message. I only had heard the music. And while I was painting, what I came up with was exactly suited to the message that was given, which kind of blew my mind because I ended up painting some sheep in a forest. And that's exactly what the pastor was talking about. Of course, I mean, if you're talking from the Bible, you've got probably a 50-50 chance that it's going to have something to do with
sheep. So did they like show it live while he was doing the sermon? They were showing the process of you painting?
No, they showed it during the worship time.
Okay.
Because I was painting during the worship time. So they were filming the worship. They were painting, they were filming the worship. It happened to be a classical pianist and a violinist. And while they were playing, I was painting. And I have to say, painting while listening to live classical pianist and violinist was pretty off the hook. That was really great.
Yeah. So you completed the whole painting in like an hour or something?
Yes, but what I had done was I have a kind of painting that I do that I call my redemption paintings, where I take an old painting that was kind of a failure and I turn it upside down, and I will just brush some paint over the top of it, not completely obliterating what's there, but just kind of getting away from the lines, and so that I'm not always aware of what I'm painting over. And I had done that. I had kind of prepared a canvas that way, and I brought in that prepared canvas. And then from there, I just worked from that base color and then developed. So I basically painted a big tree and then these sheep down kind of grazing in the pasture below the tree. So it wasn't a lot of painting that had to be done. I guess I could put it on pause and I could bring the thing up so we could
that'd be cool.
Talking about maybe that hold on.
That'd be very cool.
So I think we're recording again, although it didn't say recording, but I'm hoping.
I have it. So if we have an issue, I've got it. But I was just saying that your experience of the process of creating the work, I can understand very much how that could be a part of the worship experience. Whereas working in oil paint or working the way that I'm working isn't something I could ever do as a part of the worship experience. And so does it fit in the kingdom? You know, that's sort of my question. Like that's been my question for the last few years, because of course, I assume you had this experience the same as I did, and sort of growing up in a similar time period where arts were not really important in the church. You know, they weren't really valued or significant or a part of anything, and they weren't considered something that could point us to God. And I feel like we've been forced to consider that now in a different way. And also the opportunity has opened up to us to think about that in a different way. So trying to think about what it means. And I know Roger Scruton has, you know, in his video that he did on beauty, where he talks about the idea of a painting that he talks a lot about a lot of interesting ideas about beauty, about what it is and what it isn't. But one of the things that really struck me that he said was this idea that a beautiful piece of art points us to God, and a less beautiful piece of art points us to ourselves or to the artist. And so that is something that I've thought a lot about, like how can I create work? And then of course I can get all up in my head and, you know, be too focused on having a plan ahead of time about what it's supposed to look like. And I feel like I work best if I sort of allow the Spirit to move in the process. So how do I start with an idea and then move, which is actually really interesting to me that you feel like you need those boundaries, because for me, again, it's just so fascinating, you know, one person's a foot and one person's a hand and somebody else is a toe. Because I have a very hard time, like my worst painting, I think I do when I have a deadline, because I'm just never happy with it, as opposed to if I can just work with it and allow the Spirit to speak to me as I'm going through the process. And I have a million ideas of things I want to paint, and sometimes I start out with the idea that I know a little bit about what I want to say. I know something that I want to speak about relationships, or I know something that I want to speak about the way that light illuminates, or you know, things like that. But a lot of times it becomes more clear to me as I'm going, like the whole Ice Cube series, which was all about transition and all about sort of allowing ourselves to be willing to move through the different stages of our existence. And it started for me with being about aging and then being about moving. But then I felt like it was so prescient about COVID, you know, and what happened in all of us moving through this experience of transition and change. And how do we do that in a way that that reflects the light, that celebrates the places that we've been and also the places that we're going, and that understands that we're just moving from one stage to another, and ultimately, you know, ice evaporates, but it's still a part of the experience. So things like that
But if I think about your ice series, though, think about the tightness of the constraint that you gave yourself.
Mm-hmm.
All these things that you want to communicate, and you're communicating them through ice cubes. You're not building this huge panorama with a dozen people doing all sorts of different things and planes in the background and balloons, and you know, you're not doing that to try to tell your story. You're telling your story with ice cubes only. That is a very tight constraint. And then that brings out all this creative thought, and it opens this space between you and the viewer, for the viewer to see all of this creative thought opening up through an ice cube. So what you do is you focus the viewer right down to the thing that's most important, right? This one element that you have included in your art. And I just think that's amazing that you can do that.
Well, I guess the interesting thing is I don't start out with the idea of what the boundaries are, you know, like
But did you start out with the idea, I'm only going to paint ice cubes?
I'm sort of drawn to the idea and the concept, and then I kind of work hard to remain open. It's, you know, always that like where do we soften? Where do we maybe that's it. Where do we soften and where do we create those boundaries? Like I'm working on this series. In fact, I'm going to start another Ice Cube because I really do love doing them. So I have to sometimes take a break because I work on that for a while and then do something else. But there's so much that becomes more clear to me as I'm working on them. There's like just all these ideas that come out of it, but I don't know what they are when I begin. A lot of times I'm trying to be open to what it is that that I'm supposed to share. But then other times it is about a relationship. Although even in that, there's, there are things that become more apparent as I go through. But the interesting thing too, I was thinking is deadlines feel like boundaries to me. And maybe that's not what you mean. Maybe that's a different term. And
well, when I'm talking about boundaries, I'm talking about just exactly the kind of thing you're doing there, where you have a subject, and through that one subject, you're telling a multitude of different stories. Every time you start a new painting, you're telling a new story through that one subject. So for me, one time that subject was a lute player, one time it was a piano player, one time it was a cello player, one time it was a vase of flowers with 3 peaches in front of the vase of flowers. Every painting, though, was unique, and every painting told a different story, but my boundary was that one thing was all I was going to do 20 paintings of that one thing. And then that forces you to enter that space that you talk about when you're painting, where you're having to very thoughtfully interact with your materials, with your substrate, with your ideas, with the colors, with the ideas that are flowing back to you from the painting. And when we're in that kind of meditative flow state when we're painting, I think we're also in touch with something else, right? Whatever that something else is. So all of that interaction is taking place while you're painting. And I'm sure it's the same way for composers. I'm sure it's the same way for singers or musicians, that when they're actually in the flow state with their instrument, that there's more variability that comes in. Each note, they're confined to the, except for jazz players, but let's say in a symphony, each player is confined to that sheet of music in front of them. And yet that they're not confined, because that is the place where their greatest creative impulse can shine through those few notes on that paper between them and their instrument and the music and the conductor. Something magical happens when every single one of those people, confined to their one space, all come together doing their creative best in that environment. Like if you took a bunch of computers and linked them all together, and each computer was doing a different part of the symphony and hooked it up, it wouldn't sound like anything, because there wouldn't be any vibrato, there wouldn't be any variability, there wouldn't be any imperfections. And it's all of those things that make the beauty out of a piece of music, right?
The imperfections, I know. I always think it's like having a machine that gives you a massage versus a person. It's very, very different, It doesn't, like one of those kneading machines never quite does it.
Although I wouldn't mind having one in my back room.
I know, but wouldn't it be better to have a masseur, like like your own personal, that would just take care of it? I think though, like, how do we invite people into that? And so here's the other thing that's been occurring to me, a couple of ideas. One of them is, I started studying Exodus a few years ago, before Jordan Peterson did, which was very fascinating to me, or right around the same time. I had actually heard Eric Weinstein back when he was part of the IDW, and before COVID, he was talking about, said something about, in an offhanded way about, and he is Jewish, has that background, and talked about the idea of having to get out of here, like we have to know when it's time to leave, and he made reference to Exodus, and it just struck me. It was like one of those things that I didn't have any idea why it struck me or what it meant, but it just felt like something significant. I had no idea what he meant by getting out of here. And then that idea came back. So anyway, I've been reading through Exodus slowly and carefully and thinking about it a lot over the last couple of years as Jordan Peterson has been prepping for this study on Exodus, which is pretty fascinating to me. So that's one of the things that we're working towards in the group that I'm doing. And I still hope to invite other people to participate in that and figure out the logistics of how we're going to do that and what we can do with the show. But anyway, it's amazing to me that in the 40 chapters of Exodus, 10 of them are dedicated to describing the way that the tabernacle is going to look and what the artisans are to create. I mean, that's pretty amazing, like fully a quarter of this book that's about these people who are called to be a representation of God, and they're called to create the space that is going to be like a portal, talking about science fiction before, like it's going to be this portal that allows their experience of God, that will strengthen and inform them in order to be what they're called to be in the world. And 10 of 40 chapters are dedicated to what the tabernacle is supposed to look like. And, we've talked about it before. The first time that there's a mention of the Holy Spirit is the Holy Spirit, and I never can say their names right, but Bezalel and Aholiab, the people that God has appointed to do this. And these two people that came out of Egypt, this very cultured city, and most likely had demonstrated their ability to kind of create and do these things before. So Moses has this massive vision of what the tabernacle is supposed to be like, and he comes and shares it with the people. And so that means it's significant, I mean, there's something really significant about the way that looks. There's even things I think about, I won't go into that, like the blue and purple and scarlet material. There's a whole bunch of things I've thought about in terms of that as well. But so here's this first place that's going to be the place where people meet God, and it's all about what it looks like. And we pay no attention to that in the church. We don't give any credit to the people. I mean, a little bit, and I shouldn't say no.
Well, I mean, I think you're specifically speaking about Protestant church right now.
Yes.
Yeah. Because certainly in the Orthodox Church, they put a lot of importance on the beauty of the inner, both the outer and the inner of the sanctuary.
As does the Catholic
Church. Yes.
So yeah, exactly. You're right, and that is certainly connected to my own experience growing up Protestant, and then as a believer, as an adult, being Protestant as well. So it's just very interesting to me, how have this huge percentage of Christians missed the significance of what it is to be beautiful and to create. And then I know recently Vervaeke and Peugeot and Peterson have been talking a lot about truth and beauty and goodness. And I keep sort of hearing that from other people too. And I don't remember if it was John Vervaeke that said, it might have been him, it might have been something else I heard recently, where they said the way into truth and goodness is through beauty. And I was like, all right, that is very significant too. That was another thing that really struck me too. Like, how do we make space for the beautiful? What does that mean? Like, how do we do that? And then Jonathan's call to artists like 18 months ago, where he did that very serious, kind of like, this is the time that artists need to be tuned in. There's a role that we have. And I think that's very true. I think we've been on the verge of this new moment, sort of like the Renaissance, or like where something massive was changing in our understanding of what's going on. And I know that sounds a little crazy, but I have thought this for a long time, and maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like there's enough going on in the world that we can identify to think that could be true. And I feel like artists have a role to play in that. I don't really know what it is. I don't know. It's like right on the edges of my thinking, but I can't quite identify it. So I'm just trying to stay in touch. So today, this is what happened to me this morning. I was reading, and I was struck by the fact I have thought for a while about the idea of the golden calf being this warning, like, this is what can happen. Here's all these instructions. The people covenant with God. This is what they're going to do. And then Moses is gone a little too long and they get nervous and anxious. And so they create this false God, this alternate God to what God created. But today I was thinking about the fact that there are 3 verses in these 40 chapters of Exodus, 3 verses that describe what happened. And again, in contrast to those 10 chapters in Exodus that are all about the description of the tabernacle, this is the people get nervous. They go to Aaron, he says, rip out your gold earrings. And then he takes and makes their gold earrings into a golden calf, and says that he uses a engraving tool, and apparently which is like a stylus. And apparently that was a pretty common instrument. It wasn't something that required the skill that is described that Bezalel and Aholiab have in their, or all the skillful people. So, and when they talk about the people that are creating the curtains or the people that are creating the outer covering, it had to be thousands of people working on this. So it was this whole congregation directed by maybe the composers, as you described, compared to Aaron grabbing the gold earrings and using this very common tool to create something that the people worship. So that made me think, like, how have we done that today? What are the ways that we have taken art out of the kingdom and made it into something base and common, so that it's confusing for people to know how to respond to, which is certainly my experience, that Christians or non-Christians don't really know what to do with art if they're not artists. They don't know how to, they're told that these things that are not necessarily something they want to look at, or something that demonstrates the skill and learning that the artist may or may not have participated in. They don't know what to do with that. And so they end up turning away from it because it doesn't make any sense to them. And somehow that feels connected to me to the story of what happened when Aaron, who is not identified as being a skilled artisan, creates something with a common tool and puts it out there. So I don't know. What do you think about that idea?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts. Let's start first of all with this idea that something is happening, that there needs to be a movement in art in response to what's happening. And that seems inevitable because the trajectory of art since let's say since the mid 19th century, the trajectory of art since then has been all in one direction, all moving away from beauty and towards that which is coarse, hugely simplified, brought down to the nearest common denominator, and it's gone through various phases. Now, I was made aware the other day through a comment on one of my episodes of Nancy Pearcey's view of the Impressionists, which I hadn't been aware of before. She's a philosopher, and she said that the Impressionists were kind of the beginning of this time of particulating everything down into what could be empirically observed and then painted, like dividing light up into all the various pieces and putting the pieces of color next to each other the way that the pointillists did, and other impressionists. They're just painting the impression of light. They're painting the impression of the colors that they get from the light. So in a way, it was this move towards this scientific view of the world. And then we went into the abstract period where they're abstracting things out. So, Picasso's faces or Braque's work with all of the angles and taking things apart and making them all angular. And there's some great beauty in many of those things. There's still beauty in many of those things, but that started the breaking apart and the fracturing. And that moved through the 20th century to the point where, let's forget making a golden calf. Let's just take a cow and cut it right down the middle and put it in formaldehyde and call that art. you know, and that's, I can never remember his name.
Damien Hirst.
Damien Hirst, yes. And now in the late 20th century, I remember I stopped going to museums in the late 20th century, pretty much in the United States, because it was all video now. You go into a dark room, there's a little video screen over on one side, and somebody has maybe taken a video of cars moving past a camera and just counting the cars that are moving past the camera. And then the art is all in what they make of that, and they put in the little paper that sits next to the video screen telling you about the deep underlying meaning of these cars moving. Well, this is what people are being told now to respect as art. How do we know what art is anymore if that's what art is? And
yes, how do we know what it is? That's the question. It's
so if anyway, my point is, if we've come that far, there's nowhere else to go. Unless there's an inversion, like Jonathan is always talking about, where everything just flips and we go back to highly skilled, very beautiful artwork. That seems like the only place to go.
It does seem like there is a bit of a turnaround towards realism again. I know there's a conference that I attended a couple of years ago that I'd like to go to again, and there are 5 times as many artists as there were before, and they've talked about the idea that it is gaining in popularity, and it is certainly something that demonstrates skill. When I was teaching in a brick and mortar school, I used to take my high school students to New York. It was about a 4-hour bus ride, and we would go alternate to MoMA or to the Met every year. And I'd have students every year that would be very upset about the work that was at the Museum of Modern Art. They didn't like it. It was, upsetting to their spirit. And sometimes they would cry. Sometimes they would tell me they didn't like it. And it wasn't necessarily people that I considered to be super sensitive, and cry not because they were moved, but because they were disturbed, like what is this is upsetting to me. I don't know why this is something I need to look at. And I find very much that I'm soothed by beauty. I have that written on my website. It's something, and I do think that throughout my lifetime, the beauty in nature or the beauty in things around me has really helped me, not just to sort of calm me and soothe me, but has helped me to understand more about truth and goodness in the things that I define, even like working in the garden and seeing things. And it's just, but I'm not sure how to express that. And I'm not sure why why that's missing from the way we look at things. And
well, a few years back, maybe, probably 10 years ago now, there was an art exhibit in San Francisco at the, I can't remember which museum it was at, but it was one of the museums in San Francisco. And it was called The Cult of Beauty. And it was mainly pre-Raphaelite art. So it would have been late 19th century, I guess. And the work was just ravishingly beautiful. It was some of these paintings, of the knights, Arthur and the Round Table, and Guinevere and Ophelia, and you've seen that. It's almost like fantasy art, but the colors and the textures, and John Williams, I can never remember his name, but guys like that. I mean, just ravishingly beautiful work. And I remember feeling almost uncomfortable that I was enjoying that beauty to that extent, because it's something we never see in our world anymore, especially in such abundance, to just be surrounded by this depth of beauty and longing. And so I wonder if there's a time when beauty tips over a little bit, where you go a little bit beyond and it becomes something to lust after almost. I was always puzzled by my reaction to that.
that's very interesting, because I I would think it could be uncomfortable because it was so uncommon. As you said, we never are in that place. But what made you feel uncomfortable about it? Like, was it just that the emotion that was coming up within you in itself was uncomfortable? Like, and would you have had that same experience if it was a sunset or leaves coming through the light on, I mean, light coming through the leaves in the fall or something?
Well, I mean, they had that too. I mean, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
obviously these paintings, many of them are vast, and so it's not just people, but there often were these gorgeous landscapes with light coming through the trees and rivers, and maybe it is a kind of a longing. There's a kind of we have this longing for something that beyond, right?
C.S.
C.S. Lewis always talks about the
Right.
longing for the
Right.
country, the
Right.
far country.
Right.
And so it may be something about that artwork that sets up that longing, almost making you want it now, the here and now. I like I said, lusting after it, like I wanted to be there. I wanted to be in those paintings. And it was, so that was very unsettling because generally I'm very happy with my life. But I don't think I realized at the time that what I was really looking at was that longing for the far country, like this is what beauty could be. But then there also was, it was a very controversial time in the art world with the Christian community at that time was very opposed to that kind of beauty art because
Really?
yes, because they felt that there was something idolatrous about it.
Well, maybe the same reason that the Protestant church got rid of all the beautiful things in the churches, right? Yeah.
So, I mean, and I want to give everybody their due. There may be some edge, like every single thing that we experience in the human realm has both its good side and its bad side. So even beauty can have its good side and its bad side. So when we talk about truth, goodness, and beauty as the transcendentals, we're talking about the ideal, perfect truth and goodness and beauty. Like look what we've done with truth in our day. We can say my truth, your truth, his truth, her truth. So we've divided truth up into pieces, and maybe we've done the very same thing with beauty. And we have done that, like beauty, when we say beauty is in the eye of beholder, it's saying that I see a different beauty than you see.
Yeah.
But is that really true, or is there a beauty that is discoverable that is not either my perspective or your perspective of beauty? Right?
Or is it just that I don't understand it? There's so many things I wish I had a better understanding of. And oftentimes when we do learn about things or open ourselves to things, we become aware of things in another way. Like Roger Scruton talked about Wagner's opera, the one about Salome, and there's a part of it where Salome kisses the head of the severed head of John the Baptist, and he talks about what does it mean when we experience sort of compassion or understanding for the dark side? Like, is that a beauty that we're responding to wrongly, or is it beautiful because it's truthful to some part of us? Like if we're rooting for the villain somehow in a piece of theater or and I don't know, is that the same thing or is it a different thing? Sometimes I think I just don't understand things well enough to get there. And I so want to do God's will, like I so want to do what he's called me to. And I so often just feel inadequate to know what it is and to be able to do. Like I feel like he's given me an ability to paint. He's given me an ability to see things. He's given me an ability to know how to take what I see and do something else with it. And I want to use that gift in a way that honors him, but so often it feel selfish because I love doing it. You know, I mean, I could paint forever in the studio. So how do I, and then, you know, that goes back to like for years not doing it the way I could have, because it felt very selfish. There was always somebody who needed something that felt more important. And so I didn't spend as much time in the studio as I might have. And what would have happened if I did, you know? And yet I trust God that this is the life he's given me. And I'm so blessed, and I have a wonderful family. And so how do I use the rest of my time, whatever it is, in a way that both honors the gift that he's put in my life and also honors him and points to him and not to myself or to something false?
That's the question, isn't it?
Mm.
But I mean, it sounds like the fact that you're grappling with that question, you must be just in about the right place. You know, I mean, because I grappled with that question for years too. And like I said earlier, the last couple of years, I haven't been doing as much painting or hardly any at all. Excuse me. Because I've been working so intently on this YouTube channel.
Mm-hmm.
But I have the same struggle with the YouTube channel.
Mm-hmm.
For most of the time, if I could, I would spend 20 hours a day researching for this YouTube channel, reading, researching. But there's always something else that calls me away. I'll be right in the middle of a thought and I think, okay, I'm going to get it written down this time. And then somebody needs something and I have to go do it. And I lose the thought. And then I think, am I not being faithful to God and not getting these things written down and figured out? Or obviously he has a bigger plan. So I'm going to do the things that I'm called to do to help the people that need my help now. And many times it's in doing those simple things like cleaning a bathtub or fixing a meal or something like that, where my brain starts to think in a new way and pieces fall into place. And so, you know, we can think we have to be doing what we want to do in order to achieve something, but really there are also things that we need to do that keep us grounded, that keep us connected to the community. You know, things that I do for our small group or just taking care of emails, taking care of business, all those kinds of things that keep me grounded. So I can't just float off in this happy space that I'm in, you know? And so, I mean, I think it's all very confusing, but there is a tension there. And I think that tension is a good tension. Mm-hmm. And this comes back to boundaries. It's a boundary thing, right? The thing about boundaries is you don't want tight boundaries. Tight boundaries are never good. A boundary always has to have some give to it. It has to have some edges where it touches up against another edge and then the two can meet together. There's connecting places. Boundaries have to have like osmosis where you can breathe in and breathe out through the boundaries, through the edges. And paintings are like that. I'm betting I could look at that painting over there up close and I could say, many of your edges are very, very subtle and very soft and very permeable. And yet you'll have places where the edges are more distinct because that's kind of place where you're trying to get people to focus in some area where the edges are very distinct. Well, that's the way boundaries are too. They have to have that. They have to have those subtleties and they all point towards something.
That's a good way of describing it. Permeable boundaries.
I mean, if you just think like a cell wall is a perfect example. Because cell walls are not only permeable in places, they actually have these little channels, ion channels in them, embedded in the cell wall that allows for chemical signals or electrical signals to move in and out of the cell for communication. And in a painting, like one of the things we used to learn a lot about was to have large value shapes in your painting. For the most part, if you're doing an abstract, there may be a reason to just have scattered lights and darks throughout the painting. But for the most part, you're supposed to have large value shapes that are clustered together. And if you have a number of people standing next to each other, the best way to make that into a large value shape is to have some sort of a shadow that moves from one person to the next, or a light that moves, that is kind of working its way through this group of people. And then it's in the way that you link up those lights and darks in that large mass that makes the painting so visually striking. So you can see it from across a room and you know immediately what it is because those value patterns are so striking. If you look at the old masters and you kind of squint at them, you'll see these large value patterns, lights and darks. And that's also a way of making linkages. So the boundary doesn't always have to be around a particular thing in the painting, but a boundary around the relationships in the painting. So, because you're not painting things, you're painting relationships. Like with your ice cubes back there, each ice cube isn't a separate thing stuck on there. That's all one large shape. And then there's ways that those shapes relate to each other and the ways that they're connected both through the darks and the lights. I can see it from here. So yeah, there's a whole lot of stuff we could talk about with truth, goodness, and beauty, and we just scratched the surface. But I'm kind of losing it. So,
and this was nothing compared to your usual discussions about the scientific things you get into and what it means. And yeah, just thinking about how do we get there. So, are there any particular ideas that are sort of? I know you said you haven't really been in the studio lately. If you were going to paint, is there anything in particular that you are feeling drawn to? Any ideas or concepts that you're thinking around?
Well, if truth be told, the reason I haven't been in the studio a lot is that the last thing I worked on was a painting that's 4 feet high and 8 feet wide. And it's of 7 women in a forest. And I have some problems that I can't solve, and it's not finished, and I can't solve the problem. So every time I walk in there, I'm confronted with this painting, with this problem that I can't solve. I can't figure out a way to move forward. And there's something in me that just doesn't want to start something new until I finish that painting. So that just may be the last unfinished painting of Karen Wong. Just hangs there forever unfinished because I have a small problem that I can't solve. And you know, there aren't people that want, there are no art consultants that wander around to help you solve your problem.
Well, if you were my student, I would tell you absolutely start a couple more and let it sit over there in the background and look at it and now and then, and it will come to you what it's supposed to be. But just keep painting. It's like the Art and Fear book, you know, and the pottery. You just have to keep creating and things will come out of that. Even if you end up painting over that someday because you just can't get there, the genesis of those ideas will be inherent in whatever you create from the start of that piece of those women. And so it will become something different. And you still learned through the process, you know, you still went through the creative process where you were open and willing to change and willing to absorb the things that came for you in that time. And that's all great. It's so hard, isn't it, though, because we feel like it's a waste, kind of like if we paint over what we did, then
I've painted over this painting 3 times. I could send you the photographs of the iterations that it's gone through. And the last time I painted over it, it was almost perfect. It was really there, but there were a couple things that I just couldn't work out. And so rather than just setting it aside, I decided to paint over it one more time because my theory is always paint more and more paint. And then if you add more chaos, then the thing will arise up out of there. But I added a little bit too much chaos the last time I painted over it. And now I'm just kind of stuck. Like, where do I go from here? You know, it's had no shortage of chaos. But And as I told you before, I'm going to have a surgery later on this fall. And so I have to get everything ready for that. And then after that, and after a surgery, it's a little bit physically debilitating, and painting large paintings like that requires a lot of energy. So
How about some nice little paintings?
probably
Could you
won't
do
get
some
back
little
to it
paintings?
soon.
While you're recovering, could you do some little paintings?
Well, here's what we have to do. We have to do a meetup for everybody, not just the artists, but all the scientists and everybody else that watches the channel.
Mhm.
We have to have a meetup out here in California, and then I'll have everybody come into my studio and we can all do a project together. How would that be?
That'd be great. That'd be very
In fact, we
cool.
could get a really big canvas and we could have everybody make a mark on the canvas, because that's one of the other things I like to do is get other people to make my chaos for me, and then I make a painting out of it.
Mm,
That
yeah.
would be a blast.
Yeah, that would be very cool.
Yeah. We could have the guys build the canvas for us. I could get the parts and they could build it and stretch it, and then we could just put that thing up there and start working on it.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk offline about how we can plan this meetup. And
All right.
And if anybody wants to help with the planning, just make a comment in the comment section. Then we'll know if that you got to the end of this video.
That's right. That's right. We'll see what.
Oh, I was gonna show the sheep painting. Let me see if I can bring that up for us.
That wasn't the finished version you showed us?
I didn't ever show it.
With the tree?
Once we put the record back on, I never showed it. But anyway,
gotcha.
this was it. I was planning to show the 3 preliminary paintings as well, but I can't figure out how to get those up on the screen. So anyway, you see the sheep and the tree. There's 2 trees there.
It's very cool.
The tree of life is the one in the foreground. So that was one I did in the hour during the worship service.
I love that. I could never do that. I could not work in the worship service.
Well, that's because acrylic is just way easier for something like that. Way easier. Well, this has been lovely, Sherie. Let's get together again soon.
Yes, always good to talk with you. I appreciate it so much.
And I will put the link to your website in the show notes.
Thank you.
And also, if you want to send me a link, or maybe how would you want people to get in touch with you if they want to join your group chat that you do every 2 weeks?
My email's on my website, so
okay, I'll just put it on your website. Sounds good. Okay, have a great day.
Thank you, Karen. Take care.